Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today we wrap up the book of 1 Samuel 30:31. And we find David on his way back from the front lines because the Philistines had said, "We don't trust your loyalty." So back to his town, Ziklag, where his family was. It was part of the Philistine territories. But while Israel and the Philistines had been distracted, the Amalekites had arrived. And they had plundered Ziklag, dragged off the women and children and livestock, and also invaded some of Judah. Well, when David and his men arrived and they saw that their families had been taken hostage, verse 4 says, "So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep." This is a fascinating comment on the general who had, killed 10,000. The one that the disenchanted valiant warriors had gathered around. The one who had killed Goliath. And then verse 6 is even more alarming. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. So his 600 men were weeping. They'd lost their families. And now they want to stone David. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And he called the priest. And he said, "Listen, I want you to inquire of God. I want to go after these Amalekites. Is God with me?" Now, let's just pause there for a moment. How often is it that we hit tragedy? We have a roadblock in our way. We have, people come up against us. And we feel like David, weeping, no strength left. What do you do when those closest to you turn on you? What do you do when those who you were counting on their loyalty, counting on their partnership, decide to turn on you? Well, David gives us the answer here. He found strength in the Lord his God. Now you say, "Well, God, that's easier said than done when the world's falling apart." But the only source of strength in that sort of chaos is to run straight to the Lord, which is what he does. And the men see the courage in him. You see, he drew courage from the Lord, and those who were wavering around him saw the courage, and they all saddled up and went after the Amalekites. 200 men. He had to stop because of exhaustion, so he only went on with 400 men. Anyway, he saw the Amalekites, drunken stupor, wallowing with all their loot, and he takes them out fully. He gets a couple of hundred Amalekites escape, but he kills the rest. And as he's bringing the herds back to his hometown, his men come across the 200 that were too tired to come and win the battle. And they say, "Well, you're not going to share the plunder. Take your wives, but you're going to know none of the plunder." David stops them in their tracks. And he says, "Listen, when one of us win, we all win. Some are behind the scenes. Some are looking after the supplies. Some are actually holding a spear in their hand. When we win, we all win." And he shares the spoils with all of them. And then he ends that chapter by giving some of the spoils to the rest of Israel, who, remember, he was protecting Israel as he was on the run. Now he's funding Israel while he's on the run. It's an amazing, amazing action from a man who is anointed king, but not yet accepted. The door's not yet open, but he's still living as if that promise is a reality. When God's spoken over your life, when he's spoken over my life, and the circumstances aren't lining up, we're being betrayed and we're being stopped and we're being blocked, are you still working toward the end which God has called you? You see, God had called him to protect Israel, to govern Israel, to provide for Israel, and he was doing that even when the odds were against him. And so a great example for us. Well, the last chapter sets us up for 2 Samuel. Saul dies. His sons die. Well, Saul commits suicide because he sees the battle is lost and he's wounded. The Philistines come and they hoist him up on a wall. They take his head off and they nail his body to a wall. And that's how the book of Samuel ends. Some valiant men from Jabesh Gilead hear that Saul is pinned up against a wall. They walk through the night. They take his body off. And now we're ready to see 2 Samuel. Well, I trust you've enjoyed the book of 1 Samuel and that God has ministered to you. Remember, it's historical fact, but it was also as God deals with Israel, it's a picture of how God deals with his church.